we want to talk today about that event, but things related to that event. First, I think we're now having this national conversation about words and language. Did they contribute? Did they somehow motivate what happened, the assassination attempt on Trump?
I don't mean to laugh, but this is the third week in a row we're talking about Joe Biden's words, but for a very different reason.
Yeah.
Right? 2 weeks ago, it was like, could you hear them? Unfortunately, some of the words we have heard post-debate are now something that we're talking about, because in a private donor call, Joe Biden said it's time to get past this debate and put Trump in a bullseye. And it's one word and one phrase, and no one's going to say that phrase is why what happened in Pennsylvania happened. But it's words and phrases like that, and I think it's the larger culture that's been permitted to exist that I think it's absolutely fair to hold under a microscope. Yeah,
and we're going to talk about that today. We're also going to talk about the Secret Service, the massive failure by the Secret Service. Now, right now, the news accounts are the Secret Service is blaming the local sheriff, the local law enforcement, which I'm sorry, it's not their job ultimately to protect the president. That resides with you. And I think there are real specific reasons why they failed in this case, not just specific to what happened in Pennsylvania, but the changes that are taking place within the Secret Service and the government that led us to this situation where they made this massive mistake. And again, we're not talking about a highly sophisticated effort. We're talking about a 20-year-old kid who climbed up on a building with a rifle and got a free shot at the former president of the United States and a presidential candidate. So we want to talk about those two sections. First, the words, and then we want to talk about what is actually going on with that organization that is supposed to be protecting our national leaders. So the words, Trump said we need to put a bullseye on him. That to me is...
Joe Biden said.
Sorry, Joe Biden, yes, said we need to put a bullseye on Donald Trump. That to me is the least concerning, because I remember a couple of years ago, Sarah Palin said we need to target these congressional candidates, and she had a little bullseye on a map, and then Congressman Giffords was shot, and somehow Sarah Palin was blamed for that, which I think is absurd. So I don't think that's what bothers me as much. They're always going to use metaphors. They're always going to use analogies. What concerns me is how they demonized, and demonized is not too strong a word, Donald Trump. And really, I think created the conditions where somebody would say, hey, I will be a national hero if I take this guy out.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And I think all you need to do is look at something that J.D. Vance himself actually tweeted out after the shooting. He said, the central premise of the Biden campaign is that President Donald Trump is an authoritarian fascist who must be stopped at all costs. That rhetoric led directly to President Trump's attempted assassination. That's what J.D. Vance said before he was the vice presidential nominee. And all you need to know that I think proves how right he was is today's Monday when we're recording this. When you hear this podcast, it won't be Monday anymore probably. But the first weekday after the shooting, the cast of MSNBC, the show of Morning Joe, the number one rated news show on that network, is not on the air.
Right. Because
no one trusts those people, just liberal pundits, to be able to talk about this issue with severity and respect and not engage in the toxicity that I think we all sort of agree at least contributed to the culture in which something like this can happen.
Yeah, I agree. And look, here's, I think, the important point that I would highlight based on what we do. Because, of course, we call out people all the time.
Yeah.
We base it on facts. We base it on evidence. So if we expose corruption, we explain the corruption. We call an individual corrupt. That's not really what we're talking about here. We're talking about something that is fact-based, that is evidentiary, and oftentimes people will notice we don't call people crooks. We expose what they did. What they are doing to Donald Trump, however, with no factual basis whatever, is saying that this guy's going to be an authoritarian, and he's been compared to Hitler. And if you walk into any room in America, any restaurant in America, and you ask, say, 100 people sitting there, would you be prepared to shoot Hitler to prevent him from doing evil? I would imagine 98, if not 100 hands would go up and say yes. So if you start to plant the image that Donald Trump is Hitler, you are now creating a justifiable reason. In fact, if you're not prepared to assassinate him, you're complicit, right? I mean, if you're not prepared to shoot Hitler, you would be somehow responsible in some indirect way, people would argue, for not halting this evil. So it creates this terrible environment that motivates acts of violence.
And it's not just you who's noticed this. We talk about where the Government Accountability Institute. We want to hear from actual government officials. Listen to what former Attorney General Bill Barr said about this very issue. Bill Barr, it's worth pointing out, is exactly notable for not allowing Donald Trump to be an authoritarian. He stood up to what was rumored to be some of those impulses. Listen to what Bill Barr said.
But what was bothering me was that the thrust of the Democratic narrative for this election year had become that Truss was a mortal danger to our democracy. And if he wins, the country's going away. And when you take that position, that is an apocalyptic and hysterical position that's bound to lead to, violence eventually.
So here's the question on this, and I don't think we can really answer it, is what does the liberal left do? What does the Biden campaign do? This has been the thrust of their entire attack on Donald Trump. And now essentially they themselves, Joe Biden himself has said, well, we need to tone down the rhetoric. I don't know how you can go back. And yet, if you're saying he's Hitler, how do you remain silent in the face of it? It puts them in a dilemma. I don't know what they're going to do, and I think it's a disaster for their campaign.
No, their campaign seems to be not in great shape. You wonder if, so much has happened and so much continues to happen. The calls for Joe Biden to step down seem like a month ago.
Yeah.
And it doesn't even seem like it matters anymore. Because for now, if you're going to call for the removal of Joe Biden, then it's like now it's a political calculation, and it seems like we've sort of ascended past that. This is a much more serious thing about the kind of conversation we want to have as a country.